What's up, everybody? Welcome to the Canes Insight Daily Podcast, Baseball Edition, powered by Anajar and Levine Accident Attorneys. We have a very, very special show today, one I'm really excited about. We have David Brauer, the author of Wizard of College Baseball, How Ron Fraser Elevated Miami and an Entire Sport to National Prominence. I read this book in like a weekend, cover to cover. It was awesome. Just learning so much about Ron Fraser, and not just his baseball acumen, his promotional acumen, his ability to really change the game and influence not only Miami baseball and carry the program to 2 national championships, set up the next 2 national championships, but also really lay the groundwork for what we're seeing with the SEC and the emergence of college baseball with packed stadiums, new stadiums, everything else. The groundwork was laid by Ron Fraser. So you're going to love this conversation with David Brauer. He wrote a really awesome book. So excited to give that to you. First, let's hear a word from some of the best friends that Canes baseball has.
This episode of the CanesInSight podcast is brought to you by our friends at Sala Astorita & Cox, a boutique law firm focusing on securities regulatory matters, broker-dealer and investment advisor regulation, white-collar criminal defense, complex commercial litigation, and securities arbitration and litigation. The firm aggressively represents clients throughout the nation. Contact them now at 561-989-9080 or visit them online at salalaw.com.
All right, we are here with David Brauer. David, how are you doing?
Doing great, Danny. How are you?
Listen, I have mixed emotions right now because we have the College World Series starting now, and it's such a great event this year. I am captivated by the level at which college baseball is right now, with the talent, with the stadiums, and everything else. But I have to say, mixed emotions because Miami is so far from that this season.
Yeah, it's such a great event. Obviously, one of the major marquee pieces of the summer calendar. ESPN's obviously brought that up to a level that everybody knows about it. It's in such demand as far as tickets and viewership, and it all goes back to Ron Fraser beating down the door at ESPN to get college baseball on TV to help that grow.
Well, let's start with you, because really I think your story of your college baseball fandom and your Miami fandom, because even though you're up there in Illinois, you're a Miami fan. Tell us how you became a Miami fan, because I think that plays into the whole story here.
Yeah, I think, in the days of ESPN broadcasting college baseball and kind of finding that on TV, kind of a jump start to the baseball season, I guess, and gravitating toward Miami because they were always on TV. And as you mentioned, Illinois here, growing up near Champaign-Urbana and going to the University of Illinois games, we had Augie Garrido as head coach here for 3 years, believe it or not. And so he rose that program into national conversations. They weren't quite Omaha level yet, but maybe he had a few more years. But he raised that bar, and so took interest in college baseball a lot more. And then, as I mentioned, you find it on ESPN, and who's on? It's Miami. They're constantly on, and then you watch the College World Series, and Miami's there. So it's like, all right, well, I kind of watched them before, so yeah, I'll root for them. And then in 1992, I made my first trip to the College World Series, and waiting outside Rosenblatt Stadium to go in for the game, and got to see Miami play. I'm wearing Miami shirt and hat, and team's getting off the bus, and just kind of as an awkward teenager walking up to Coach Fraser and being like, "Hey, good luck, Coach," and he's like, "Wear that hat with pride, son." So that was kind of a fun moment. But really this book kind of started with a visit there to Miami, about when it was about 2017. Made a trip over to Miami during a family vacation in South Florida. Hadn't been to the city before, just had a couple sites to see. You got to see the Everglades, things like that. But University of Miami was on that list. Wanted to see what it looked like, what did Mark Light Stadium look like. Went into the Hall of Fame just to kind of see what baseball memorabilia might be there. And conversation started with Earl Rubley, a former president there at the Hall of Fame, who happened to be manning the desk. And I had an Illinois shirt on, so that struck up the conversation because he had some ties back this way. And then he's telling me Ron Fraser stories, and I knew quite a bit about Coach Fraser, and it just kind of turned into, was there ever a book written about him? Because I feel like there's so much there, and that's kind of how we got started.
Yeah, and look, again, here's the book, Wizard of College Baseball, and again, the second part of it, how Ron Fraser elevated Miami and the entire sport to national prominence. That's really what this book is about more than anything.
You can get it at ronfraserbook.com, right? Which you can get on Amazon and other places that sell books, but really on ronfraserbook.com, you get 40% off with the code. There you can see it right there. So, jumping into it, tell me a little bit about the process of putting this book together, because it seems like there was a ton of research done.
Yeah, first and foremost, I mean, I wanted to create a book that was really a tribute to what Ron Fraser did, not only at Miami, but for the sport, because, your listeners, they know a lot about what he's done at Miami. Maybe they don't know what all he did across the country and how he was really helped college baseball take off and well ahead of his time. And, so I wanted to capture those pieces, like I said, not just Miami, but the whole national side of it, the international side of it, all these touch points that he had in the sport. And so the key was getting to the right people. And it was kind of funny. A lot of these interviews occurred, and I did over 100 of them, started during the COVID year. So we all had some extra time on our hands when the baseball season was unfortunately ended abruptly. That was, it was, you talk to somebody, and then, hey, have you talked to these 2 or 3 people? And then it was just like the domino. But I talked to a ton of former players, former coaches, assistant coaches at Miami, coaches at other schools, some media people, obviously some staff there at Miami that were extremely helpful, and then his family, his daughters that were extremely helpful in the process as well. So, really want to capture as many thoughts and from different angles as possible.
Now, I want to take the listener back to 1960s and early 70s and the state of college baseball, when coach really got involved, because to me, I didn't know as much about that. I mean, when I grew up, you had Clemens playing college baseball, Barry Bonds playing college baseball, pros on So it wasn't like it was it was a total afterthought when I was growing up in the 80s, early 90s. But taking it back to 60s and 70s, it seems like it was very close, much closer to intramurals than what you see today.
You're exactly right. I mean, you could almost look at it as more of a club sport, or maybe almost like a Division III, non-scholarship type of situation, because there just wasn't a lot of scholarships that were provided for baseball, obviously, at that time. And a lot of these players were football players, or baseball wasn't a real focal point. It was truly an afterthought when you think about pro prospects, because all the star players were going into the professional ranks out of high school, all the bonus babies, all those players. College baseball was just kind of like the leftovers. That was at least the, how it was personified. And so, you saw it grow eventually into the 70s there, and you saw USC create their dynasty out west. Under Rod Dato winning all those national championships. Arizona State was right behind them. They were kind of the axis of power out there was for this sport was the West Coast. And so there were pockets of success here and there. Florida State had a solid program with success. But there wasn't the powerhouse programs that you see today.
Yeah. And it's interesting seeing how much of today was influenced by coach. But before we can get to all of that, he had to make Miami something that was strong on its own. And much of what you talk about is off the field as much as on the field. But let's start with on the field. What did coach bring to the University of Miami baseball program from a baseball standpoint when he arrived?
Well, obviously he had a great coaching mind. And while he was very young at the time, I mean, he's in his mid-20s when he came to the University of Miami, because he had graduated from Florida State. He went to, he was in the Army, started coaching on a German base, American base in Germany, and eventually became the head of Dutch baseball and won championships there in European competitions. And he wanted to come back to the States, young starting family. There were only 2 job openings at the time. It was Auburn and Miami. And obviously he landed at Miami. There's some good stories and background in the book about, how that kind of serendipitously occurred. Obviously the rest was history, but getting that program off the ground was a significant challenge. One of the previous coaches, not too many years prior to Fraser, was Jimmy Fox, the great Hall of Famer. And if Jimmy Fox can't bring enough name recognition to a program, who can? And, the facilities were poor. The interest was minimal. it was a very difficult situation to get started. In fact, his first year, the team didn't even have equipment because they had all given it away. But his mandate from the athletic director at the time was, do the best you can, but don't spend any money.
And look, sometimes with those limitations, the creativity comes into play. One thing that caught my attention was there's a lot of first in this book. When you read it, a lot of first to XYZ. I didn't realize Miami was the first college team to play on turf.
Yes. Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So, in his innovation, probably thinking along the lines of saving some money also. But remember, he played a style that was, running game was important, pitching and defense, not a real big power hitting team. And so to try to use those strengths to his advantage, he was trying to be innovative, get some turf on the field as maybe a trial product. The Orange Bowl was going through turf, adding turf or new turf to the facility. And so he met with turf companies and trying to get something going. And eventually they got the turf on the baseball field. But he helped sell that because he said, okay, well, football can practice here. We can do other things with, campus life, whether it's intramural sports or having concerts or something. We can kind of build this into a facility. And that was just part of the mastery of his vision for what that facility could do, not only for his program, but for the university and the community.
Yeah. And, the promotional tactics, the stadium. I really want to get into that because that's a lot of this book. But again, some of these baseball related things caught my attention, which is like the turf, for example, and how it fits the game, but also the use of the weather in Miami to make this program grow. How did he use something that he inherited, right? That he didn't build necessarily, but the weather of Miami to improve the college baseball program?
So early in the season, the start dates weren't as early as they are now in February, but in March, Miami could get started in February, January. There were no restrictions on that. But the northern schools, it was essentially like spring training, coming down and getting a few games in, kind of like what they do now, but a little bit different. And so he would invite several northern teams down, and that would start his schedule. Each weekend play some northern teams. And then he turned it into a tournament that actually became the second largest tournament to the NCAA tournament. And it wasn't a bracketed event per se, but it was just a round robin, get a lot of games in for these northern schools. But what he would do is in that schedule, he would make sure the northern teams played each other first, and then Miami would play these teams, and they would play them in the evening. So what was the purpose behind that? Well, the northern schools then are canceling out their number one pitchers because they're playing each other. So you're going to face the second or third starter when you start getting into their depth of their rotation. And then the weather, all these guys are coming down south and they're seeing sunshine and 80-degree temperatures for the first time since the summer before up north. And so they're laying on the beach and by the pool and all those types of things. They'd get sunburned and, they weren't quite ready to play in the evening.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of the stories involve him elevating others, like elevating the whole sport, but there's a little edge for Miami to kind of come out ahead also as part of it. Mark Light, you said it's the first cathedral of the sport, which that statement in the book is on my mind because I've been watching the tournament, as we all have, watching now the College World Series starting. The cathedrals now are a whole other level, but Mark Light really was the first, right, to be even in that conversation.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And when you look at a lot of things that Fraser did, whether it's, the facilities, the stadium, television, all those things, we take so much of that for granted now, as you said, because the ballparks have come along so much. Look at these SEC stadiums that are packing in 10, 12,000 on a weekend. You can't go on ESPN Plus, or you can go anywhere, ESPN Plus, et cetera, to find basically any Division I game at any time. But obviously back in those days, none of that was possible. And so Fraser had the vision of creating the ballpark and making it a place that people want to come, get the fans out, moving games to night games. They were playing afternoon games before they had lights, obviously tough for people to attend, and making it an event. And not only doing that, but doing that in a place where you've got the beach a couple miles down the road. You've got so many other things you can be doing in the Miami area. You're not, kind of in the middle of some of these SEC locations. No offense to like a Starkville, Stark Vegas, but there's a lot going on in Miami to compete for that entertainment. And by building that ballpark, he it made it a national power because players wanted to come play there. It was the premier stadium in the country at the time. Fans flocked to it, in part because of many of the promotions that he had going as well. But, it was really that, I guess, creating that community embrace where fans wanted to come out and be a part of it. It was something they could call their own. And he wanted to make it friendly entertainment and a place for the whole family to come. The kids could run around, could be dropped off even, and just enjoy the game for a couple hours.
Yeah, you're seeing, by the way, some images from the Ron Fraser book, Twitter, which those are some awesome images. I didn't even know you had this until I was prepping for the interview today. And I've been just looking at those images, a lot of stuff that isn't in the book. And the book has great images that are not necessarily on there. So check out both. But, really awesome stuff from that era, some of the promotional stuff. And I've been teasing, and I want to get into this now because this really was a huge part of the book, which was all these crazy promotional tactics that Coach did. And really the amount of energy and thought he put into that aspect and the fundraising aspect on top of all the baseball stuff. It wasn't like he outsourced a lot of this stuff, right? So talk about, and look, you're not going to be able to say all of it because there's so many details of the book. That's why you got to go to ronfraserbook.com and pick it up. But give us some promotional tactics and some stuff you learned studying for this book.
Yeah, you could devote an entire book probably just the promotions of Ron Fraser, or we could devote an entire episode to that. But, again, it kind of went along with how do you bring people in? How do you get them interested? Let's be honest, as he said, and even said it himself, baseball isn't the most attractive sport sometimes for people to attend. It's sometimes slow paced. It's, for the casual fan, it can, like Ron Fraser said, it can get boring. How do I spice it up? We're going to have something going on between every inning. So not only did you have all the giveaways between innings, you had money grabs, you had, he was one of the first ones to have baseball bingo, which is like a staple now, I think pretty much any ballpark you go to. But the bigger promotions were maybe giveaways or theme nights. One of the really interesting ones was like open heart surgery night. It's like, how is that a promotion? Well, then, somebody wins, quote unquote wins. And, if they need an open heart surgery, they have a year to cash in on that. Obviously, it's a pretty safe bet, right? And, so it's things like that, car giveaways that people would get so excited about getting a car. But when the car comes through the center field gate, you're wondering if it's even going to make it in or back out, given its conditions. So, there are so many like that trips, that they'd give away where people would show up with their luggage. They'd have every detail covered where your ticket was like you'd get a baggage claim ticket when you came to the ballpark, and the ticket takers were dressed like airlines crew, and every detail was covered. The on the field dinner, we talk about that in the book, in terms of how he raised so much money for to cover the expenses there of Marklight Stadium, and just so many innovative things that maybe some of those pieces he found somewhere, but he just took it to another level if he didn't create it himself.
And lots of characters passing through, whether it's skydivers, Ted Williams, who's in the Keys, he pops up multiple times in the book. Joe DiMaggio, who actually used to live 10 blocks down from where I'm recording this podcast in my house here in Miami Beach. So you had a lot of people local, right, that were just kind of passing through. That his Rolodex seemed insane with the people he knew.
He took a great advantage of those opportunities, because you think about all the players coming through on spring training, all the players that maybe retired and lived there, and tapping into those resources was just a phenomenal move on his part. Because as I talk about in the book, Mike Pagliarulo told me the story of, he grew up in Massachusetts, he's playing at Miami. Here's Ted Williams telling me a little bit about hitting. He's like, you gotta be kidding me. He's almost like an extended coach, showing up and teaching the players. And, there were so many instances of that, playing exhibition games against major league teams while they're preparing for spring training. Just a genius move to tap into those types of resources, and certainly add credibility, because, what college player wouldn't want to go to a practice and listen to Joe DiMaggio or Ted Williams, or have them involved in your program in any capacity?
Yeah. Oh, it's unbelievable. And look, the baseball stuff, I would say you got to read the book, because you don't go through every season necessarily, though I pretty much touch on them all, or many of the key ones, and just kind of some of the characters and things that made those teams great. But certain things jump out of my mind, which is, 1974 winning the national runner-up trophy, and then it becomes a doorstep to a toilet in the bathroom. Talk about the competitiveness of Coach Fraser.
He was highly competitive. Obviously, I think that's one of those characteristics is you have to have as a coach to be successful. But, his vision was not only the off the field things and the fans and the entertainment side of it, but obviously to win. And growing this program, they came so close so many times when they started to get NCAA tournament invitations. At that time, they were all districts. It wasn't like the bracket we see today. You're pretty much locked into a geographical territory. And so you'd see a lot of the same teams many times. And so there were a few years where, a couple teams had their number and they just couldn't quite make it out of those district tournaments to make it to the College World Series. But that 74 season where they made it to Omaha for the first time and knocked off the mighty USC Trojans that were the dynasty of the time early in that tournament, put them on the map for good. And, there was an opportunity to certainly win the national championship. As you said, they ended up falling in the championship game, but the notoriety that they got out of that and the name that they built, everyone took notice nationwide. And that first national championship finally came in 1982. Obviously, many of your listeners probably know that wasn't the most talented team. He had a couple teams that were just preceded that were loaded with players, major league players. I mentioned Pagliarulo, Neil Heaton. There's so many players that came through there. And it's kind of ironic that as much talent as he had with some of his teams, his two national championships came with teams that really were kind of the underdog story.
Yeah, and it's a lot of what you talk about in the book. I think that you have a great perspective for this because you're one of those people, is how Miami was perceived by others, not just locally by the community, but like how Miami was perceived in Omaha by people watching on ESPN like yourself. What made Miami stand out, not just in this community and here in Dade County, but across the country to people just tuning in?
I think exposure, first and foremost. When we talk about the College World Series, there's a story I was told that, when Miami would go there, Fraser would take a bunch of hats and shirts and pass them out to people they'd see at the hotel or maybe going to the ballpark, create fans, right? Now they're going to root for Miami because now you got a little bit of a home advantage. If you've got fans behind you locally, they're trying to figure out who to support. And, that helped grow the fan base. But I think the television side was what was so key, because now they're on television a couple times a year. ESPN made them their game of the week or college schedule darlings, and they had so many appearances throughout the 80s, so they become a household name. Obviously the football program kind of takes off after the baseball program kind of set that model for success. And so now everybody knows who Miami is. And just seeing them in the College World Series all the time, I think that resonated. The top players wanted to go there. You knew you were going to be on television at a time when, television games were very few and far between. And, I think that's really where that mystique took off. I think the colors of the uniform, the Miami mystique, the style of play, the hidden ball trick in the 82 College World Series. I mean, all these elements come together. The notoriety from these, crazy promotions and news stories. I mean, he had news stories from 60 Minutes and national news outlets that have nothing to do with baseball, talking about what he's doing off the field. So, I think all those factors, you just constantly saw that name, and that's how it became such a powerhouse program. It really was the team of the 1980s. They were the marquee program in the nation.
And one thing you talk about is how we have first round pick talents, let's say, starting to go to college to play baseball, which, now I'm looking at the College World Series, and the majority of the mock drafts I'm seeing in the first round have guys that are playing in this tournament. It was not the case back in the day, certainly, but Miami started to change that a little bit, right?
Absolutely. And as I alluded to earlier, the 60s, you were an afterthought if you're playing college baseball. You weren't good enough to go to the pros. The scouts weren't interested in you, whatever the case may be. That was the perception. Now you look at it today, you've got, like you said, so many of these players, they're dominating the draft more because they're more polished, they're ready to go. But what happened in between? A lot of that came from Fraser's campaigning to make college baseball better. How do you do that? Do you get some support from Major League Baseball? He was a good friend of Bowie Kuhn, the former commissioner of Major League Baseball. Had him in for fundraisers and different things, and really spreading that message across the country of how can you make your program better? How in different parts of the country can you build maybe the regional powerhouse? You look at the University of Maine in the 1980s, they went to the College World Series a few times. And Fraser was really good friends with their longtime head coach, John Winkin. He even took a trip up there, which is why does Miami have to go to Maine to go play a game? You don't have to, because they should be coming to you. But he did it to help promote that program. It was a huge event that weekend. It was things like that he did. He did it in his backyard with schools like Florida Atlantic when they were starting their program. He didn't have to put them on the schedule. He had the powerhouse. What do they have to gain from winning over Florida Atlantic? And he helped them build their program because of that notoriety. They played Miami. They eventually beat them a game. That exposure, going to Stetson, a program, do you really need to make that trip up there when, they could come to you anytime? But he knew the power of building interest for multiple schools, helping them grow the program and how that benefits the sport. And you see that, in those pockets, but then obviously in the SEC, when Skip Bertman took the blueprint, went to LSU, built a program literally out of nothing. Ron Polk, who spent a couple months as an assistant coach at Miami before he took the Mississippi State job right before a season in the mid 70s. He built a powerhouse obviously there at Mississippi State, and then it just grew exponentially because the SEC at the time, they didn't even have full-time baseball coaches. Ron Polk was the first. It was an assistant football coach, or maybe even an insurance salesman. Who knows? Doing doing the job in the spring. So all that kind of rolls together into how he literally created a blueprint, in a sense, of how to build a program, how to gain interest, and grow the sport.
Yeah, let's see. I want to get to that in a second because that was like my biggest takeaway from the whole book. Just again, maybe because of what we're watching here in these the past tournaments. But before we get to that, some on-field innovations that I took notes that I had no idea was, just use of signs, use of the closer. What were some of the things that he did on the field that were innovative in college baseball?
Yeah, you mentioned two of those right there. I think the closer is probably one of the biggest. He had a team in the 70s that starting pitching, you're expected to pretty much go the whole game at that point in baseball. And, he wanted to get some bullpen guys to try to finish those games out, struggled with, getting those wins and getting to the next level and getting to the College World Series. And so he employed basically a closer. And, that obviously changed the game. And so many teams followed suit with it, and it was successful. But, things like, you mentioned the signs. He had innovative set of signs that were hard to pick up and steal and try to figure out what they were doing. His style of play, just very aggressive on the base paths, lots of hit and run, using that turf to his advantage. I think that was a key part of the on the field, just, establishing that as kind of the go-to for success in college baseball.
And the coolest thing about the book to me really was I'm sitting here in Miami Beach. I'm on the sand. I'm reading this book. I get to about halfway through, and Ron Fraser retires as coach of the Hurricanes. And it's like, I flipped to the end. I'm like, is the other half of this book just like, like a bibliography or something and the rest of the book talks about his influence outside the Hurricanes. It's like you watch a movie and the main character of a sporting movie retires halfway through the movie. That's unusual, right? But I think the editorial decision worked when you read the other stuff. But before I even get into some of that, just as an author, like, was that something you thought about? Like, hey, I'm going to stop talking about you and baseball in the center of the book?
Yeah, that was something where, how do you navigate all that? Because there's so many pieces of the story that occurred outside of the University of Miami. So if you're going to just take a chronological approach, and you might be going on in so many different directions, and then you're coming back to what he did at Miami, and, it would probably be hard to follow. So, it really, the mission was to tell that story of what he did at Miami and with the baseball program, but also the influence outside of it, as we mentioned, college baseball as a whole, the community, professional baseball, all these different pieces that, he was just such a different character that, you can't put him into one box and describe who he was.
one aspect that comes across a lot is his influence on world baseball, right? And obviously he was very close to the Dutch national team, being there really from the beginning. He's still an icon there. I think to nowadays World Baseball Classic, which to me is the best tournament in sports, just as a fan, I can't get enough of that event. Netherlands is often one of the best teams, if not the best team from Europe in that event, and they compete pretty well. Talk about his influence on world baseball.
Yeah, obviously in Europe, he made the Netherlands the power. The Dutch team consistently won those European championships. You still see that today. That's the preeminent nation in terms of baseball in that part of the world. But as he got involved here in the U.S., some of the things he did, he started at Miami, where he would take some goodwill trips in the summer, take some players, mostly Miami players, sometimes his entire whole team, and go down to some of the countries in Central America, and they would gather supplies and to help the people there, but also some baseball instructional manuals and things like that. He had a baseball instructional manual in Spanish that was he created that was such a hot commodity there, so they could learn the game. But then they'd play exhibition games, and so you'd play like the Nicaraguan national team. They faced Dennis Martinez, in a game. But these trips and these experiences for the players were phenomenal, and some of these stories were pretty crazy, and we put in the book. But he then said, okay, well, how do we take USA baseball into something? And Rod Dado had really kind of laid the groundwork with that, but most of his focus was on the West Coast, and he would take trips to Asia, play in Japan, play in countries over there. And Fraser kind of had that Central America, that Caribbean experience. And so, okay, how do we make USA Baseball more organized? Then we get to the USA Baseball Federation, because it really wasn't a true organization at the time. It was almost like just some college coaches creating an all-star team, and you're just going to go play in some international competitions. And then he wanted to get it to the Olympic stage. And again, he and Dado were so instrumental in that. Dado coached the first team in 1984. Ron Fraser, the first time the sport was a medal sport in the Olympics in 92. And so that was, one of the great stories was the 87 Pan American Games and Team USA against Cuba. There's a lot of correlation there between like Miracle on Ice in the 1980s that we get into in the book, but it was such a big deal for him to coach that team and to get a win over Cuba.
Yeah, you took my next question, because I'm Cuban. Peter, who's producing this, is Cuban. A lot of our listeners are as well, obviously here in Miami. And there's a story in there about basically the Cuban organization expecting Fraser to kiss the ring with Fidel Castro, and he did not do it. He actually made Castro come to him. Talk about that event.
Yeah, that was a remarkable story. I had multiple people tell me that story in different form, but it was such a powerful event. So Team USA went down to Cuba, playing a series, and obviously that wasn't happening a whole lot given the political climate. And so here's Ron Fraser to coach at Miami, and obviously a large Cuban population that came to South Florida. And so he knew the political tensions, and it was obviously very close to him. And in for that game walks Fidel Castro. And obviously the whole stadium stops, the game stops, and all the Cuban players rush over to him. Well, then he wants to come down to the U.S. dugout, or he wants the U.S. team, to come to him. Fraser said, no, I'm not going to do it. He can come to us. And so I guess almost in the brink of an international situation there, he navigated it perfectly and, was cordial, but he wasn't going to capitulate to Fidel Castro, even on his home turf.
And then all these years later, you got USA beating Cuba by about 30 in the World Baseball Classic, bringing it full circle. But, people like me reading this story brings a lot of joy to our hearts.
And when you look at it at the time, Cuba was such a power. It was unreal. And you look at that 87 win over Cuba in the Pan American Games, they were literally unbeatable and just rolling through teams. I mean, it was like taking a major league all-star team, because some of those players could have played in the major leagues and been all-stars against some college kids. I mean, he didn't have a chance, but that was just international competition at the time.
Yeah, you see Jim Abbott make an appearance in the book, some very familiar names. That's one thing with the book, just all these names you don't expect to associate with UM baseball pop up just because of this guy's influence in the game. It's totally. One story I wrote down here I wanted to ask you about was the scheme to figure out who broke curfew via autographed baseballs. So tell us a little bit about that one.
Another ingenious move of Ron Fraser. Go on a road trip, and I had a couple players tell me this. It happened in multiple locations. Probably something he couldn't do every year because they'd figure it out. But every few years, when they were at on a road trip, players obviously want to go see the city, whatever the case may be. But he would take a baseball and find somebody on the hotel staff, and maybe it was a bellman or someone at the front desk, and give them a Miami hat, talk to them about the team, get them excited, kind of make them a fan. And they'd say, you know what, I've got this baseball for you. Why don't you get the autographs of everybody that comes in and tonight, and let me know who you got on that ball the next day. So the next day he'd go get the ball, he'd look at it. He knew which players came back after curfew because it was the way he timed it. It was just perfect genius. And, he'd be on the bus and call out the players that were in some hot water, and they wouldn't know what hit them because they had no idea how he made that work.
Getting back to something you touched about previously, which again blew my mind, is you look at the book. I mean, again, you look at the back of the book here, you can't really see it as clear because of my green screen. But on the back of the book, you have Ron Polk from Mississippi State, Skip Bertman as the first two folks giving you quotes for this book about the impact of coach on their lives. When you read about what's happening in the SEC now, and there's been articles in ESPN, major publications, just talking about the explosion of college baseball. It starts with those two. But really, what your book explains is that it really starts with Coach Fraser before anything else.
It really does. I mean, the seed was planted in Coral Gables. The blueprint was created. All those pieces that Fraser put in to build the University of Miami into the team of the 80s, as we talked about, the powerhouse, all those things are what you need to be where you are today. Look at these top programs today. That's the level of success you want to attain. And so when Skip Bertman left to become head coach at LSU, he knew what he had to do. That was, a program at LSU that, kind of like Miami, didn't have much. They, didn't have any attendance. They played in an old rickety stadium. Nobody followed LSU baseball, which is unfathomable today when you look at it. Ron Polk similarly at Mississippi State, although, Skip had more of the promotional side. Ron Polk was very much a baseball guy, and building that success was how he wanted to get people into the ballpark. Skip was kind of more on the promotional side, a little more Fraser to him in that regard, and obviously spent more time under Fraser at Miami. But those two, in their different paths to get to the same level of success, started that run in the SEC, because the SEC didn't win a national championship till 1990. And these guys had built it where, okay, they had two teams that were really good. Then some other schools are saying, okay, what do we need to do to get in this mix and get competitive? And, that's kind of where it really began, is Ron Fraser to Skip Bertman. And we have to include Ron Polk in that as well. But taking that level, just infinitely growing it, because then every team wanted the big stadium. Every team wanted to have the success. And now you look at where the SEC is today. But Ron Fraser had 6,000 or 7,000 people at Mark-Lite Stadium in the early 80s, when that looked like 15,000 that you see today at Arkansas or Mississippi State.
Yeah, a couple details here that just blew my mind. He's like the Forrest Gump almost in some of the events that he finds his way into. The Florida Marlins and now the Miami Marlins, and how they ended up here as a Major League Baseball franchise. How did he have a role in all that?
Yeah, his fingerprints are on bringing the Marlins to South Florida and getting a Major League expansion franchise. In the 80s, when Major League Baseball was looking to expand, and South Florida said, okay, who's our best guy to kind of show what baseball can be in South Florida? Well, we look at the program at Miami. Look what they're doing. And so between his just, the way he just conducted himself, he knew everybody, he could talk to everybody. He was such a likable figure. That was the perfect guy for them to be kind of a front man to talk about the virtues of baseball in Miami and what it could be at the major league level. So that's kind of where that started. when they got more serious into the 90s about it and putting expansion teams where they might go, he was again invited by the groups from South Florida to say, hey, can you help sell this? And of course, Ron Fraser could sell anything. So he was one to really be instrumental in getting a franchise in South Florida. And there were often discussions of what kind of job would he take with the Marlins. It was almost a foregone conclusion that when he was done at Miami, he would move over to the Marlins, or when the Marlins came into town, that he might just step into that role. So, he had a significant role in that, and probably underrated in terms of the effect that he had.
Yeah, last one. I keep saying my mind was blown because there was so many moments I was like, what is that? How could that be right? That the University of Miami football program, which obviously is changed the game of football similar to how the baseball team changed that sport. That at one point, when the university was considering dropping football along with basketball, which was temporarily dropped, that Ron Fraser came in and said that's probably not a good idea.
Yeah, football survived being cut by one vote, and Ron Fraser was very influential in trying to sell keeping football around at the university, and persuaded that vote to go that direction. And you look at it later then when Howard Schnellenberger came in, and of course when he walks in, he's coming from a pro environment as an assistant coach with the Dolphins, and you're looking at, okay, what's this guy doing with baseball that's got this place buzzing all the time? I want to do that with football, because, as you know, the attendance was not good at the Orange Bowl. The success was limited. And again, much as Fraser had the blueprint for college baseball, he kind of had the same type of recipe, at least for football, to take a look at and say, okay, maybe we want to incorporate some of this. This is how they get attention. They do a lot of promotions. They get involved in the community a lot. Howard Schnellenberger picked Ron Fraser's brain quite a bit about how to build that program, and even mentioned so, and we have some of those quotes in the book. But so he had a hand in that too. It's not something that really you can even comprehend at this point in college athletics, that a football program may have taken a page from a baseball program. But I think that was certainly a part of the success there, when the U became the U, but the U was the U before because of Miami baseball.
Yeah, and the lesson to me is Miami sports, Miami athletics has often been looking for the Miami way or how Miami has done it. But really, when you read this book, you realize the key is innovation, trying to do the next thing. And that's really what Coach Fraser was about, was the innovation, doing things that had not been done before to adjust to your unique circumstances and what you have to offer that other schools may not offer. So listen, we talked about a ton with this book, and I guarantee you it's only an inch of what this thing is. There is so much in here. Cannot recommend it enough. RonFraserBook.com for 40% off. You could get it any other places, Amazon. It's a nationwide book, but I recommend RonFraserBook.com for the discount. The Wizard of College Baseball: How Ron Fraser Elevated Miami and Entire Sport to National Prominence. There it is. There it is again. David Brauer, man, appreciate you. Thank you for joining us. You did an awesome job with this one.
Thank you so much. Appreciate you having me on. And I encourage everybody to take a read. I think you'll really enjoy it, whether you're a baseball fan, just a Miami fan, or just have any interest in sports, especially at the college level.
Absolutely. Go Canes.
Yeah. This an insight to the Canes, and we ain't playing no games. Joaquin said dominate, so that's what we do. Home of the legends and 7th floor crew, down in Miami where hurricanes brew. You here for the rumors, we bring you the news, cause it's all about the you. And nobody do it like CanesInSight. 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 It's CanesInSight.